Welcome to the lecture for Death and Despair for ICA. My name is Kenneth Steinbach. I'm one of the instructors for ICA, and today we will be taking a look at a number of artworks whose themes deal with death and despair from a variety of different perspectives and with a variety of different motivations. Joining me today and with my talk is my dog Ernie, who is sitting over here a few feet away in his bed, chewing on a plastic water bottle. So if you hear a few crinkly noises during the talk, that's what's going on. I hate to kick him out, even though it may be a tiny bit distracting, because he just loves these lectures. He learns so much. We have great talks afterwards, and he always likes taking the exams too, the quizzes. So aces them every time, by the way. So as we think about death and despair, an obvious question comes up. Why do we do this? Why do we have this need as humans? To sort of deal with death and despair in our work. And honestly, if you look at the topic of death and despair in all of the different media, theater, art and music and popular music and all of this stuff, both of these subjects occur again and again in a variety of perspectives. There's just like tremendous amount of artwork that is specifically made dealing with these two ideas. And part of that is just being human, because we use our artwork to pull meaning and to generate meaning from these experiences of death and despair. And arts are one of the ways that that takes place. Ernie seems to be giving that water bottle quite a workout, so I think we'll just let him be. I think he'll settle down here in a minute. There are several reasons that artists have, or several different kinds of motivations. There's several different ways you could say that art that deals with death and despair, different motivations or ways that it is used within in the larger culture. And the lecture today is going to be divided into these four areas. The first is catharsis. We have a desire as human species to express and describe, personal loss and social tragedy. We like to record these events for history. When things happen to us that are difficult or unpleasant or tragic, we have a desire to not only just tell other people about it, but we want other people to sort of understand, the emotional response to it as well. We have this need, and it's just something that's kind of baked into us as humans. And that is one of the, as you will see as we go here, that's one of the reasons, that's one of the principal motivations that artists have for wanting to sort of deal with this topic. A second one is this word called gravitas. Gravitas really just means an emotional weight or a heaviness or a seriousness. And that is that art is made about these ideas to create an emotional weight about them. It's one thing to go through a tragic event, but in communicating that with other people, if you feel like people aren't sort of understanding the intensity of that for you, or the weight of that, or the impact of that on you, art is a vehicle by which that can occur. It allows us to, it generates emotion, it allows us to communicate, those intangible, more emotional things, with greater impact. And that is an important thing for us, because we want people to sort of experience what we have experienced. In addition, we also want to experience the things that people who have gone through these tragedies have. It's part of what we do as humans, as we are brothers and sisters. We are a community, and we want to bear that weight. We want to be empathetic, with each other. Another reason that we sort of make art about sort of death and despair is to memorialize, and this is maybe one that people would think of a lot. Like art that is sort of about tragic situations or things which have been very difficult. We make memorials to that. We'll look at several memorials further in this lecture. That have been made directly as a response to difficult circumstances, loss of life, and things like that. But art is a way for us to remember, and not only to remember, but to shape that meaning, and the way that remembering gets sort of plays out in the larger community. And finally, art can be art about very difficult circumstances, death and despair, can be a vehicle for change. The act of making art and experiencing it can transform negative experiences into positive ones and allow us to look forward in an authentic way. It can emerge from a desire to leave a legacy in that way. And I want to be clear that this is not about saying that all negative things should be, all negative experiences should be transformed through art to become positive ones, which would be a really superficial kind of approach and a very superficial spirituality. But what it's saying is that within darkness, we can be pointed towards light. You can never leave that darkness behind, some of the experiences that we go through, but we can, ultimately find ways out of that or remedies to that. And art can be a vehicle for generating that and pointing us in those directions. So we're going to be starting in this first category of catharsis, which is a desire to fully express and describe personal and social tragedy. Like, what are the stories we tell about it? Because that's a very foundational thing. It's like we go through an experience of difficulty, we want to share it with other people. And of course, it happens on social media immediately. Art is a little bit different than that, because the way that art functions in these ways is to sort of slow the process down and to, sort of create a more considered approach. It's not just communication, it's not just the evening news, but it's a lot more about, like, how do we sort of regard it? How can we think about this in a more intentional way, in a more creative way? I always like to show artworks from the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and if you take a trip down there at some point, you will be able to see this one in person. This is a artwork by Sir Alfred Gilbert, made about 1880. As I've noted a couple times in classes before, it's a theme that I consistently bring up, that the Minneapolis Institute of Art is an excellent place to take a date. First of all, it doesn't cost anything, it's always free. Which is a great idea. And also, you can go see works by Van Gogh, like the actual artworks. You can see, they got Monets, they got Rembrandts, and they just have a massive amount of really wonderful stuff. And so don't go thinking, well, I'm going to feel stupid because I don't know any of this stuff and I don't know what to say. It's like, yeah, don't do that. Go down there, take a friend, date or not, who cares? But go down there and just take a look at what they have and see it. It's wonderful stuff. So in any case, one of the things that you can see is this Sir Alfred Gilbert. You can't really see from this, particular lighting, but the marble that is used to carve these is carved so thin that you can literally see sort of light through it on those wings. It's just sort of a gorgeous, amazing carving. And I like to start with this one because it's kind of a traditional way of thinking about sort of, telling a story of a death or commemorating someone or sort of catharsis, capturing something. Sir Alfred Gilbert, the subject here is a Roman legionary who's fallen in battle, and he's embraced at the moment of his death by a genius, or by the spirit of victory. Basically, he's dying, but he is dying in victory, and the individual, the sort of the deity that behind him is sort of capturing him and going to whisk him off to better places, no doubt. Gilbert began the sculpture as a private memorial to his brother, who had died only months before Gilbert started working on the piece. And so this is a curious situation where Gilbert, had plans for this. Excuse me, had plans for this, and then within a short time, his brother passed away. It was a very tragic situation for him, and so this became a memorial. This became a monument to him. And again, a bit of a catharsis. This is highly symbolic. It's reaching back. If we were to maybe share an experience of our own personal loss, some of you have lost grandparents or other family members and whatnot, and communicating that, we may not be tempted to sort of think back to Greek and Roman times for models for that, but it certainly is something that happens a lot in art, as we realize that our experiences align with many other experiences that people had in the world, and connecting those, making those connections is powerful, and can sort of expand that and give us a kinship with the greater brotherhood of humanity. Another series of works that deals very directly with sort of this notion of sort of catharsis and telling, and sort of just relaying information and trying to communicate the emotions of experiences is by Goya. It's a series of prints, is about 100 of them or so, called The Disasters of War. Goya was a Spaniard, and he was in Spain, late 17, early 1800s. Napoleon comes in, and Spain falls to Napoleonic forces. Goya was what was called a court painter. He was hired by, or just like employed or worked for the Spanish court, mostly painting pictures of royalty and whatever the king or queen wanted. He painted that. And even during, like, when Napoleonic forces came in and there was this kind of this mixed government for a little while, he was still employed as that. And so he was sort of painting French. Napoleon was French. He was painting French officials. He was painting sort of the Spanish, individuals as well, that royalty. But then on the side, he went out into the landscape, because the landscape at this point was ravaged by first the Napoleonic, conflict, and then the subsequent minor skirmishes and kind of these Civil War kinds of situations, where people were just doing terrible things to each other through warfare. And nobody really knew he was doing this. He would go out and he would sort of make drawings in these very precarious situations. And here was a guy who, as a court painter, he had easily just stuck his head in the sand, that I'm not doing this, I'm not taking any kind of risk, because this could easily have sort of put him in some kind of danger had he been discovered, that he was doing that. He was going out and eventually made a series of about 70 or 80, no, I said about 100, I think it's closer to 100, of these little etchings. They're not very big, they're about the size of a computer screen. And he's literally just kind of documenting what he sees. And so everything that you're finding here is really just things that he had witnessed and drawn from life. And they're horrible, And what's really kind of compelling about this is that he is depicting such horrible things, and he is rendering them so accurately and wonderfully. He just is applying the artist's craft to this. And part of what allows us to be experienced with these pieces is, the tragedy really is made much more impactful by the fact that he is such a draftsman. He's so carefully rendering these tragic situations. One of the prints that I find the most powerful from this series is this one right here, titled Such Valor. And by the way, these are like Goya's quotes down below that he's writing on the text. Such valor. And the scene that you're looking at here is a woman who is sort of involved in this fighting. The people that are around her, probably family members, have been killed, and so she takes up the cannon. And she is sort of, going this. And again, these are things that Goya would have seen. These are, he's drawing from life. He's kind of seeing this stuff here and rendering it. But just as an abstract composition, it is really powerful. The white skirt against the black wheels, the enemy who is unseen off to the left, this woman who's also unseen. We only know, of her valor by her proximity to these people who have fallen, and the posture, this attitude that she is taking here. It's just, in terms of, the compositions of blacks and whites and the renderings and the overall composition, the directional forces of the cannon kind of shooting off to the left. They're really, really exquisitely crafted. And all of that is applied toward this notion of allowing us to feel what he really felt, what he wanted us to understand about the reality of this situation. A curious thing about this set of prints is that Goya never showed these in his life. They were probably too politically hot for him to do. He was a court painter, but he kept them. And after his death, they were sort of put out into the world, and there have been many copies of them. With prints, you can make multiples of them, and so many copies of these have been made. And so it kind of asked some really interesting questions. What were his expectations for this? Did he sort of want to, clearly he wanted to document it, and clearly he wanted to keep it as a form of legacy. And it's just, shows a brave heart by this individual who was willing to sort of do this and risk so much as an individual who was very privileged in this society. Next, I'm going to talk about this guy right here, one of my favorite artists, H.C. Westermann, who is a sculptor and made a lot of drawings. He's from the Midwest, but his formative experiences as a maker, as an artist, occurred when he was a Marine and he was in the Second World War. He's one of my favorite artists because I have such sympathy for this generation. This is my father's generation. My father, was in both of the conflicts that H.C. Westerman was. My father was, in the Navy in the Second World War, and then he was in Korea. And that's kind of H.C. Westerman's experience as well. And I just kind of I feel like I know these guys. They were sort of tough, reticent. They didn't speak a lot, about the things that they had gone through. But H.C. Westerman, the thing that I've always respected about him was the way that he allowed those experiences that he went through that were very difficult to emerge in his artwork, which is a different kind of courage. H.C. Westerman is typically known for his sculptures. He over his lifetime he made a few hundred sculptures, and we're seeing one over here on the right, which is made I think out of aluminum. And probably stands about 2 feet tall. The reference here, the point of reference here, is actually a television set. He's so kind of get 1960s television set. That's sort of the image, but it's he's kind of created this other thing called the Angry New War God. I'm not actually going to be talking about that one so much, but I think it is important to just kind of see a little bit of the kinds of things that he created. What I am interested in talking about is actually the drawings that he made, and I have 2 examples here. As a Marine in the Second World War, one of H.C. Westerman's experiences, what he saw combat several times aboard a ship, and those became formative experiences. They became images that he could never put down. And in his drawings and in his sculptures, he just returns to these experiences again and again and again. And you can see the death ship, for example, the USS Franklin, which was a ship that he had witnessed. That had been sort of hit by what was called a kamikaze bomber, which was a suicide bomber, a Japanese suicide bomber that would fly their planes into the ships. And so the Franklin was hit, and it was something that H.C. Westerman had witnessed, big explosion. And so you find all of this stuff here, even though Westerman is treating this in a very cartoonish way, these do represent experiences that he actually had, and it's an interesting tension there where the playfulness or the cartooniness of this communicates a different kind of emotional intensity, a different kind of emotional energy. So you can see what's happening here. The ship is coming over. I believe that the ships, those types of Japanese bombers that they came in, they called them Judies, and so you can see the top right, the Judy is coming in, hits the ship, and then down below, the ship has now been transformed from the USS Franklin to the ship is now called the Goddammit. And you can see the death's head on the right, and the shark swimming in the water, and there's a buzzard sort of looking at it. There's all these symbols of death, and then he has a personal notation there about, to all of this, you add kind of the smell of the experience. And so in here, he is really trying to capture this. But what's interesting is in treating it as an artwork, he makes it more accessible in some way. He doesn't necessarily make it easier to take, but he allows it to have, there's sort of a dark humor about it that, it's kind of a military dark humor that you see there. And this is the kind of scene that he would have witnessed firsthand. I don't think that this was the actual SS Franklin, but this is kind of what we're looking at. And again, these experiences sort of haunted him through his entire life. And so they just sort of emerged again and again, and often in his letters, he was a prolific letter writer. He would make these drawings and send them off to other people. And this one, he's sort of writing to a friend, and he says, "Dear Gene, here's the same drawing. I love to do hundreds by now over the years. This drawing is like learning to do handstands by the hundreds. They vary, of course. I never get tired of it, and maybe someday I'll learn how." What a statement that is. Maybe, what is the how here? Maybe someday he will learn how to make this accurately. Maybe someday he'll learn how to, maybe he'll be able to sort of unload, the emotional baggage, that he is carrying, because of these experiences. What does that how really mean? It's a really intriguing thing to me. It's like I just, You can just sort of see this guy sort of searching, looking for a way to unload this emotional freight that he's been carrying with him. Final artwork by H.C. Westerman. This is another one of his sculptures. Very funny, and again, like H.C. Westerman's work is it's just humorous from front to back. It's a very dark humor. It's a very funny and kind of fatalistic humor. But he did a number of death ships or kamikaze ships, and one of the ones that is perhaps the most lighthearted is this one right here, where you have this sort of monolithic ship form. And it is a death ship run over by a '66 Lincoln Continental. You can see the tire tracks, sort of rolling over this ship. And then again, these other symbols, kind of dark and funny symbols down below that, floating in a sea of money. The little shark that's kind of swimming around down there. So. Another reason that artists make artworks about these difficult experiences is to give them emotional weight, and I would say that H.C. Westerman could easily have been fit under this too. It's like, why is he making these drawings over and over again? Because he's trying to capture something. He's trying to give it enough expression of form that he can communicate the weight of it, the emotional impact of it, to other people. Some of the ways that we experience death and despair in our lives is not necessarily sort of large and grand and about the loss of life. Sometimes there are smaller forms of despair or smaller forms of loss. I have a few artists that I've thrown in here whose work I think is a little bit lighter note, that kind of deals with a few of these things. Jean Shin, who is a contemporary American artist, and we actually have a relationship at Bethel University. She showed out here. We had a really wonderful experience with Jean Shin 6-7 years ago, where she did not this piece, but another installation in one of the galleries. A piece by Jean Shin that she did fairly earlier in her career was this one called Everyday Monuments. And so the video projection that's behind the set of trophies that are in the front is actually a video projection of the trophies, so it just kind of helps you see them a little bit more. But Jean Shin put out a call for people and just asked if they would sort of donate old trophies that they had that they didn't want anymore. And so she collected all of these trophies, and then she and her assistants, they altered these trophies. And so if you look behind there, you can see like there's a guy with a drill, and I guess maybe a woman with a drill, and there's a guy with a tire he's holding up. There's somebody with a step ladder, and there's a number of people here who have these. Basically, what she was doing is like recreating these trophies or repurposing these trophies for individuals whose lives are maybe not grand. They're not necessarily, or who maybe his work lives are not grand, who are sort of working in tire shops, and they're carpenters, and they're maybe doing the laundry and stuff like this. It's often not regarded, and she just wanted to value that. And I think it's a response to this. Giving weight to this is just a wonderful thing. And so, Jean Shin looked at this, and so many things that we do are not valued or not regarded, and she wanted to acknowledge that, because so many of these things are gifts to other people. Fixing somebody's car well at a reasonable rate in a way that they can trust is excuse me, it's a massive gift to a single mother you don't even know, and those people are never or seldom acknowledged. They're not given trophies. And so I do love the way that she kind of steps up, and she creates reparation, or she adds an acknowledgement and a kind of thanks to these moments that could actually be despairing if they were never acknowledged. If you're working in an auto shop, when you are never acknowledged, if you're only sort of screamed at by a boss, that could be a small death in your life, a small despair, or even a big despair in your life. And she kind of transforms that. She tackles that and wants to thank people for those kinds of moments, those kinds of efforts. Another artwork that we can look at, that is giving sort of emotional weight to, an interior point of view. This artist named Edvard Munch, and Edvard Munch was best known for the Scream painting. It's a tiny little painting. The guy, it's basically just kind of a head with his hands slapped against his cheeks, like Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone. Like that is Edvard Munch is that painter. And in this particular one, Edvard Munch was extremely prolific, just made tens of thousands of artworks in his life, many, many, many paintings. And he also explored the entire range of human experience, and he tended to spend a lot of time, in the darker parts of, our human experience, those that deal with death and despair. And this is, I think, an example of one that that we can look at that illustrates a bit of that. It's a self-portrait, as we can see, between the clock and the bed. On the one hand, as we're looking at this, it could just be a guy standing in a bedroom, kind of, sort of looking out at us. But if we understand the difference between subject and content here, the subject is Edvard Munch painting himself in his bedroom, but the content, which is kind of like what's actually going on, what the artwork is saying, is we start to look at how Edvard Munch is sort of positioned here and what is the environment that he's in. To his right, our left, you see the clock, and the first thing to notice, of course, is the proximity between and the relationship between Munch and the clock. They're both the only dark things in this space, really. They're both right next to each other. There's a strong kinship between them. Okay, and even to the point where Munch's face and head looks just like the clock dial, and he wants us to understand that relationship. He wants us to see that relationship. So when somebody that you have known that has gotten old, like yourself, where do you see a person aging? You really kind of see it in their faces, and so he's making a relationship here between the face of the clock and the face of himself. They're both about sort of age, they're both about passage of time. And then just off to the right side there, you have a bed. And on the one hand, it's a bed, but now that we have Munch here, he's an older man, he's thinking about death, he's thinking about, sort of going from a vertical state maybe to a horizontal state, and suddenly this bed on the right, with this ghost-like figure, sort of arising from it, is not just a bed. Maybe it is like the ultimate bed. Maybe it's sort of like, the ultimate, where we're all going to be horizontal at one point. And so this is a bit of meditation. What at first just kind of seems like a guy standing in a bedroom, painting in an expressionistic way, actually is really a meditation that he has created about this point that he is in his life, between sort of life and death. And he sees, the end. He is sort of looking at the end and assessing that experience. The next artist we're going to look at is actually not Velázquez, but we want to just notice this one for a minute, because we'll pop ahead in a second and look at an artwork that's based on this one. But Velázquez was a court painter. He was a while before Goya, but in the same Spanish court, and painted popes and kings and their children and their offspring, or whatever whatever they wanted him to paint, he painted. And so at one point Velázquez was painting Pope Innocent, who is this one right here. Take a look at that Pope. Holy smokes, that is quite a face on that guy. You notice that one of the things that is like almost front and center in the portrait is the Pope's ring. The tradition is that when you meet the Pope, you kiss the ring. It's a symbol of submission to that power. And so this is a guy who is clearly used to that power. It's kind of hard for me to believe that he actually got away with painting this portrait of the Pope, because it does demonstrate such an unsympathetic character. One critic wrote that this Pope is peering out from the corner of his eyes at a difficult and treacherous world he is shifty enough to master. And so this was a work that was seen by our next artist, Francis Bacon, and used as a point of reference. Francis Bacon, who is a more contemporary British painter, 20th century, he certainly would have seen the previous pieces, just a train trip away, and he would have been able to get down to Madrid to see the other ones. Um, and this was the portrait of Velázquez directly named in the title of this one. But Bacon made a whole series of these pieces called they were kind of shorthand called the Screaming Pope series, in which he is kind of dissembling the image, or like dissecting the image, or dismantling the image in front of us. And where the previous image of the Pope is all about sort of worldly power, and he's the guy in control. In Francis Bacon's version right here, it's Bacon is sort of dealing with existential despair. This is not something. He transforms this previous portrait, which was kind of dark and menacing. He takes it forward to like this really existential conclusion where he is rendering a space that is just about a total fracturing of meaning itself almost. It's like not only is there no Pope, the Pope is kind of disintegrating, and along with it everything that has might have meaning and might have order, and it's a very, very much kind of a scream, about a scream into the void, you could say. This dismantling and the destruction of everything is represented by the dismantling of this Pope. We're going to zip ahead a little bit to 20th century America, an artist named Ed Kindholtz, who worked in this way of fabricating things called assemblage, where you sort of take things from life and you put them together in a three-dimensional way. So he's making some of the things, he's assembling some of the things, he's sort of buying others' stuff and putting it all together into a larger installation. And what you are seeing here is a piece that was done in the mid-70s. And Kindholtz is referencing what's going on around him at that time, which is the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War kind of started in the early 60s, slow escalation. But by the time he is making this piece, there's a lot of individuals, a lot of young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, that are being drafted and being sent to Vietnam, and a lot of people are being killed. There's about 58,000 people killed in Vietnam, Americans killed in Vietnam during that time. And one of the bifurcations, you could say, one of the splits in American culture at that time was the fact that Vietnam was so isolated, it was far away. Unlike Korea even, or unlike the Second World War, it didn't tend to impact the daily lives of a lot of people in the United States. And this is what Kindholtz saw was, you could go down to the ice cream, corner and get an ice cream cone, and then read the paper about, friends that you had that were sort of in conflict, literally in battles on the other side of the world. And so Kindholtz made this piece as a way of sort of putting these two worlds together. So you have, this kind of, sedate sort of, hot dog chili stand with this couple out on this date, and then you have this other, this memorial that's kind of, being assembled here as a way of sort of putting these together, as a way of sort of pointing at that contrast of life and death, and life sort of at the expense of what's happening across the world, in great ignorance, maybe I should say, of what's happening across the world. The piece clearly has some wit and some humor about it. He uses that humor to great effect. And so you have the individuals, the guys who are planting the flagpole. They're just getting ready to put it into the center of the picnic table, like you do to create shade. Up on the, just to the right of those folks, you can see it's called a portable memorial. Let's see. Commemorating, and there's a little piece of slate there where you can sort of, write in the name of the war, write in the name of the victory, and so he is kind of talking about the eternal nature of war. The life goes on, but yet, it doesn't for some individuals. And again, the couple that's here on a date, so half of this composition, the left half of this composition, you have this tremendous conflict that's going on, and the battle, the scenes, the soldiers that are taking over. And then on the right side is just a fairly ordinary looking, afternoon in middle America where, these two individuals are off, having a nice time for themselves at the ice cream shop. And the quote here of of course, is actually that image right there, the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, which was an event from the Second World War. It's a very famous photo. It's kind of became iconic for a lot of reasons. But this is a direct quote that Keinholz is making within the work that he wants us to sort of put these two things together. And so in this piece, he is really trying to create gravitas. What he is seeing and what he is looking around in the society at the time and saying, there's a lot of people who are in this battle on the other side of the world, and it's very dark and it's very dangerous for them, and yet it doesn't really seem to be affecting so much of our lives over here. And he's wanting to put these two things together as a way of creating a gravitas about that situation. Well, it seems that Ernie has fallen asleep, and he's quit chewing on the water bottle a little while ago now. But I do fear for him because, sleeping through the lecture is not a great way to get a good grade on the quiz. So we'll kind of see how that plays out. The third reason, or the third way that art sort of functions relative to death and despair, is that we memorialize. And this might be the one that would first spring to mind for us. When you think about art and death, it's like, well, creating memorials. And that is absolutely true. And there's a powerful, great tradition. We're going to look at some terrific artwork that deals with death and despair. Even though the subject is very difficult, the artwork itself can be sort of really quite powerful in the way that it shapes that experience, the way that it allows individuals and also the larger culture to see these experiences in a helpful way, a stronger way, a social context, a historical context that can be transformative. And as we say here, art is made as a way to remember and shape this meaning as it gets played out in a public way. The first artwork we'll be looking at is by Doris Salcedo, who is a Colombian artist. And this is not a traditional kind of memorial. Some of the ones we'll be looking at in a little bit would be, kind of traditional memorials, but this one is not. This one is a time-based performance. And this is a piece that was done at the Palace of Justice in Colombia. And to understand the artwork, you need to understand the social context of Colombia a little bit. So Colombia, from the early, sort of mid-60s, a couple things that have happened within that country. First of all, it has been sort of ground zero for the narco trafficking. A lot of cocaine came out of there. A lot of those opiates kind of came out of Colombia. And the amount of money that was made by the narco terrorists was, especially relative to what everybody else in the country was making, it's staggering. It was just staggering. And so there was so much money generated by the drug trade that it completely screwed up everything, like all of the social, basically kind of the traffickers took over the country entirely. And yet there were other factions that did not want that to happen. There were communist factions. There were sort of elected government officials that were trying to fight that. The U.S. had its finger in that too. In any case, it was a place of great turmoil for a long time, and really was kind of not just a low-level civil war going on, but a pretty hot and heavy civil war going on at times as well. It was very common at this, over the past 50 years. It was just in the last decade or so that has cooled. But it was very common for people to get up in the morning, to go off to work, and to just disappear, because that was sort of the nature of the conflict. Is people weren't necessarily fighting in the streets all the time. Sometimes people would just be kidnapped and eliminated. And so you had all of these very different and strange kinds of losses, and also a country that was just sort of continually at war. Within that context, at one point, Pablo Escobar, some people say it was he that funded it, other people say it was other people that funded it. There were a group of guerrilla terrorists who took over the Palace of Justice, which is the seat of justice. It would be basically like our Justice Department in the United States. They took over the Department of Justice, laid siege to it with the goal of sort of conquering power, doing what terrorists do. They're putting on a spectacle, kill a lot of people and so on, which is what happened. And so they took this place over. Eventually a fire was started, either intentionally or not. And a lot of people, there's a great loss of life. About 100 people lost their life. About 300 people were held hostage, but about 100 people or so were eventually killed in this conflict. So a few years later, Doris Salcedo wanted to commemorate that, and so she made a time-based performance. And so you're seeing this progression from left to right. The initial siege took about 53 hours, when all the people were killed. And Doris Salcedo's performance, where she would take these chairs, and they were the chairs literally from the Hall of Justice, and she would lower them slowly down over, she and her assistant lower them slowly down over the side of the building, and then they would just sort of stay at a certain spot, and this performance lasted the duration, that 53 hours. And I thought at one point that there was one chair for every person who'd lost their life, but I don't know that that's true. But anyhow, it was a time-based performance about that. And a question might arise in a piece like this. It's like, well, why chairs? Why don't you use names or something that's a little bit more direct? And one of the things that I've always appreciated about Doris Salcedo's work is the way that she understands how deeply we are connected to our physical environment. If any of you have ever had somebody in your life that you've lost, maybe it's a grandparent or something, and the next time you go to their house and you see the chair that person used to sit in, right? And it's very poignant. It's like there's a presence there and an act of, it evokes so much to just have that object that person was associated with. And she understands the way that we become associated with objects. We kind of imprint on them in a way. We become identified with them. And these chairs kind of become surrogates for these experiences or these individuals as the way they get sort of lowered over. It's a way of making the invisible kind of visible. And rather than being a permanent memorial, it was just sort of a performance that commemorated the moment, and it was a very somber and very quiet kind of memorial. As I was noting earlier, a lot of the loss of life in Colombia was not in large conflagrations like that or large battles like that. A lot of it was individuals that would go off to work and just simply disappear. And a lot of Doris Salcedo's work, and there's a photo of the artist on the bottom right there, deals with the things they leave behind, And so this installation in particular, there were several different women who had gone missing, and she asked if she could use their shoes in these installations, and so she took their shoes and she literally cut holes into a wall. And it created these little niches, almost like a niche in a church, the way they have a little saint or something. There's this little niche in there, and then over the surface of that, there's like an animal skin, like a really thin piece of animal vellum that's kind of stitched into it, so you can sort of see the objects inside, but not super clearly. And again, these were shoes that would have been associated with people that had disappeared. And so in this way, she's kind of evoking the individual, but it is a way that, she talks about, the unknowingness of that kind of loss, or the unknowingness of that kind of grief, the strangeness of it, and the otherness of it. And that's what she's trying to capture, is to create a memorial that's not necessarily an easy memorial, but a memorial that leaves us with a certain kind of uncomfortableness that is akin to the grief that these people have suffered, or those family members have suffered. Another contemporary artist whose work deals with memorial, or the idea of remembering in a slightly unusual way, is Anselm Kiefer. Kiefer is German and was born in Germany in 1945. And if you know your history at all, the Second World War ended in 1945, and Germany was at that point getting sort of bombed back into the Stone Age, right? And that's what he grew up. And I've heard interviews with him where he said, when I grew up, my playground was rubble. That's what I had. And so he learned to kind of play in this, and he learned to, it kind of created this sort of, emotional context for him about sort of, life and death and rubble and transformation, because so much of what he started his life in was a place of great desolation. And so he talks about that, and so in any case, his work deals a lot with German history, and seeing German history as a metaphor for kind of larger cultural things. We'll see that a little bit more in the next slide that we'll look at, but he's looking at German history not as a nationalist, not somebody who's saying, Germany should have won the war. He's certainly not a Nazi, so nothing like that. But what he's doing is he's looking at the rise and the fall of that German history as being a metaphor or a lens to look at other sort of situations in the world of sort of empire and collapse. It's like growth and despair. And so they're all kind of wrapped up together. This particular painting assemblage, which I think is about 14, maybe 16 feet long, it's quite large. She's done several versions of this one over the years. It's called The Paths of Worldly Wisdom. And in this one, he and his assistants have made woodblock prints. If you ever done like a linoleum block print or something like that in junior high or high school art class, this is kind of the same thing. It's only a larger scale and with wood. German sort of woodblock print is a really strong tradition. So they made all of these prints of individuals, the great German thinkers from the last 200 years. There's poets and writers and philosophers and whatnot, and they are all sort of in this desert, in this forest, sitting around a campfire, so to speak. It's almost like he gathered all the great German minds together to have a conversation, so to speak. Not a literal one, but just putting them all together in this campfire. And what's really interesting is the way that the lines of this, he goes back and he like draws on this, he paints on these again and again, almost like they're sort of stuck in this giant whirlwind. And so he's not necessarily in this one talking about solutions. He's not sort of saying, oh, by the way, this guy over here on the bottom, the top right, he's the guy that really nailed it. And that would include, Jesus, because Jesus is in here too, even though he's not German. But, he's not sort of saying that. Kind of what he is suggesting in this piece, that there is certainly growth and there's certainly conversation with what's happening here. But in the end, all of these perspectives are, in the end fall short. All of these perspectives in the end do not sort of capture the essence of what the reality of the world is like. Another artwork by Anselm Kiefer is this piece called Melancholia. And this is, by the way, a full-size jet. I don't actually know the numbers of the jet, but this was towards the end of the Second World War. Germany was looking toward a lot of innovation. They were trying to sort of like, find some technological innovations to break through so they could sort of conquer all of their enemies. And one of those was a nuclear program that they had going, but another one was a jet program. The Germans were sort of just on the edge of getting to develop a jet, that could be put into practice, and jets would have been a huge advance that would have given them air superiority, and would have, might have turned the tide of the war. At least that was the hope at the time. And so Kiefer got a hold of these plans and basically made this lead jet, which probably weighs, like 5 tons or something, who knows. But it's this massively heavy, it looks heavy. This thing is never getting it off the ground ever, right? And he's talking about, kind of the failure of this. So this is not about a certain kind of success. This is a way of thinking about sort of aspirations and failure. It's like they sort of pegged their hopes on this thing, and yet it was an utter disaster because they were never able to do it, and even if they had, it probably wouldn't have mattered. And so this is about aspiration and failure, and even the choice of using lead sheet. It's not only heavy, but Kiefer is thinking about the alchemists. There were, before the advent of sort of modern chemistry, the alchemists were kind of convinced that if you did certain things to lead, you could turn it into gold, right? Because they're both heavy, they're both kind of, soft, and if only we could find the right chemical or do the right thing, we'd be able to turn lead into gold. And so he is sort of pretending or acting like an alchemist here, very much the way that, people pin their hopes on, like the way that the Germans had pinned their hopes on this technology, and only to be sort of crashed, that he's talking about that sort of that lead and that aspirations of wanting to turn it into some magical solution. And of course, anytime that we are talking about memorials, one of the kind of spontaneous memorials that I always find really fascinating by the edge of the hospital, not just merely fascinating, but sort of tragically fascinating, are those memorials, spontaneous memorials that are put up that at the site of loss of life. There's one where I drive from my house to Bethel University. I drive past one every day where there was a loss of life by the side of the road, and every day I drive past it, and I noticed this little tableau, this little memorial that somebody has put up in memory of the individuals that tragically died there. And we just had this tendency to do this. And what I think is compelling as us as humans is that those spaces become really important. And of course, George Floyd, who was killed in 2020, at the hands of police down here outside the Key grocery store. This was a photo that was taken, probably a month or two after those events occurred. I was down there. I actually didn't take this photo, but I was down there about a month after it occurred to look at the site and to see what was there. And one of the things that really struck me about the memorial for George Floyd that was there was how many people had taken it upon themselves to paint and draw George Floyd. Just like there were just dozens and dozens of paintings that were showing up, and as I was, and drawings that were showing up, and some of them were like on stretched canvas, with professional kind of grade oil paintings, and others were like magic marker on cardboard boxes, and it was just like the entire spectrum. But it was so telling, I think, that our desire in the face of this, this loss of this guy's life, that we all sort of witnessed, people wanted to sort of show up and affirm that again. And they were just, and so I think that the memorials can take, there's a big spectrum of memorials that can be made, but they always seem, it's just like human instinct we want to do this, we want to create images, we want to put meaning into this and to give lasting, durable memory to these individuals on these locations. Earlier we were talking about the Vietnam War with the Kindhold piece, the portable Kindholds piece, which was called the Portable War Memorial, which was about Vietnam, and this one here, the My Linh, the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial, which is kind of the official version of a memorial based on that. And I think this is probably quite a familiar one to many people. This is one that I frequently talk about in my visual arts class, so if you're in that section, you've heard me talk about this before. So, Maya Lin, designed this, and just to make sure that none of us feel too good about ourselves this morning, I might remind us that she designed this when she was like 25. It's like, oh man, who can live up to that? It was really kind of a home run, right at the beginning of a person's career. But there was an open call. This is how these things often go. For these public commissions, there's an open call where people design, anything. To say, well, we want to make a memorial to like whatever, we want to have this public commission, and then people submit proposals, and that's the process that she submitted a proposal that was eventually selected out of like 2,500, I think. But she came up with this Vietnam Veterans War Memorial. The memorial has some really wonderful qualities about it, but a couple things that I might note is how starkly minimal it is, and also how crazy successful this thing is. I've talked to so many people. This is a piece of art that I talk about a lot because I was too young to be sort of in that demographic that was faced with the question of are you going to Vietnam or not. but I knew a lot of people that were. It's like I've met a lot of people that were there, and this is a point of connection. And I have been amazed at how effectively this piece communicates and connects with people that have nothing to do with art, that could not care less about the art world. I had a former brother-in-law who's no longer around, passed several years ago, but he was there, and he would never, I would have to like hit him over the head with the bat, drag him into the Walker Museum. That's the only way I'm getting him into that structure. But yet he loved this memorial because he sort of got it intuitively. And I think that that's really a testament to its effectiveness, the fact that it's so minimal and yet it's so effective. So part of the genius of the design for this structure is that the names are all listed chronologically in the order of their passing, and so they're not listed alphabetically. And this is a really important thing for Maya Lin, and something that she got a lot of pushback from the military. The military is all about order and rationality, right? And they said, well, we want people to be able to find their loved ones easily. And so one of the things that she did is she went in to counter this argument, was she went and she looked up how many, like there's a name like Kevin Smith, which would have been pretty common. She found that there were half a dozen or a dozen Kevin Smiths who had passed in Vietnam, and she came back and she said, if you list these names alphabetically, you're going to have like 10 Kevin Smiths all stacked up. And what are you going to tell your mother if there's an identical name? What are you going to tell that person's mother if there's an identical name? It's like, how do you sort of give that person an authentic experience? And so what you said is like, you misunderstand what the time that is taken. So there are books there. If you want to find an individual, you have to go look them up in this book, and then there's a little guide there, and it will tell you. And often there are volunteers that will help you find the name. And she said that is part of the experience of seeing this. The other part of this, that is part of the experience of being there, is going through this, finding that name, taking that time, talking to other individuals. That's part of this as well. So it's a very, from a creative point of view, an artistic point of view, that was very smart and very important. Other qualities about this, the fact that when you stand and you look at those names, it's reflective. You always are seeing your face. You are seeing your face overlaid, reflected back on those names. That's a very important and powerful part of it as well. But it's quite an effective memorial. The way that it's, the way that it's pitched, the way that it is, sort of fabricated, the way that we enter into a subterranean space. We do not most memorials are up above ground, and the Maya Lin Memorial is actually subterranean space. We enter into the space of the dead, and that's another reason why it's physically quiet when you're there. It's spiritually quiet. It's very meditative, and it's just a powerfully effective memorial that has established itself as such a such an important place in American architecture. Maya Lin's design for the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial, which was developed in the early 80s, was one of the first to use the listing of individual names as such a prominent visual element, locating it in time and place, and using it as a visual device to move people through the space and so on. And many memorials have continued to use that device since. And one of those is a National Memorial for Peace and Justice, that has opened up in the last few years in Alabama. And this is a memorial that is specifically dedicated towards those African Americans who have been killed by lynching, although it is the title here, which suggests Americans who were enslaved, terrorized by lynching, and humiliated by racial segregation. It's not, perhaps isolated to lynching victims, but it has a focus on that. And lynching, by the way, is defined as killing by individuals by basically unlawful crowds. So it has been used in a lot of places and times, more prevalent in the South, but certainly it happened in the North. In the 1920s, there was a pretty notorious case that happened up in Duluth where three black men were lynched by a crowd up there. And so it's certainly not a Southern issue, it's an American issue. One of the more significant things that went into the design and research of this memorial was actually like collecting a database of all of the lynching victims that could be identified, that were identified, gathering that data, collecting that, documenting all of that, which was also really important. The names are listed in a couple different places, in the site. One of those is on this hallway right here. It's kind of a longish hallway where you can walk down and you can see the individuals down below here. As they are looking up, they're actually reading the names of the individuals that are on these very large solid pieces of metal that each weigh several hundred pounds. There are these massive weights that kind of hang over you, that hang down with the names of the individuals there. And clearly sort of looking up at these hanging things, there's associations with lynching methods and lynching victims, the experiences that they went through, and the metaphorical weight. There's a weight here that is not, it's a literal and metaphorical both that kind of referencing the very dark end of these individuals, what they had gone through. One of the challenges in any kind of design is that people just have varying ideas about how best to sort of represent the circumstances of things that have taken place. And in the lynching museum, one of the decisions that was made was to actually include figurative art, which is art about the figure, art that is sort of realistic depictions of that. Sort of feeling like the abstractness of Maya Lin's kind of approach where everything happens metaphorically was a little bit perhaps a little bit too abstract, for the violence that needed to be conveyed. And so at the lynching museum, you had this wonderful sculpture by Kwame Okoto Bamfo of figures who are clearly enslaved, black people who are clearly enslaved. We're not sure of the specific circumstances, but it's pretty brutal stuff. And it's the modeling of the figures is just extraordinary, just such capturing both the humanity and the majesty, but also their plight. And this is, one of the ways in which the ideas about this experience that many African Americans have gone through is sort of captured within this, memorial. And it's interesting too that even when Maya Lin was developing her memorial, that there was pushback that was also too abstract. And so off to the side, by another artist, Jill Goodacre, there's another figurative sculpture of American soldiers, which is very realistic. I didn't show that because we're kind of only so much time, but there is a conversation back and forth with these memorials, and I don't think we can say one is better than the other. I think that what we can say is that each of them bring different things to the experience. As part of the lynching memorial, there is an installation here that I find extremely powerful, and that is soil. Soil that was taken from each location of lynching sites, and the soil is was gathered by volunteers who again sort of research where these events took place, would go to the site and literally take soil from underneath those environments where those events took place. Collected, gathered, and stored here. Each of the jars have labels with names and locations to kind of identify with that. And on the one hand, I just find this really powerful in the way that it anchors us so specifically to a physical reality. It's undeniable. You just can't. There's something about the tactileness and the directness of that, and the scale of this. It's all represented simultaneously. That is sort of powerful and telling, and also just so basic.
Yeah, it's a beautiful little touch. It's sort of strange, for me to even use words like beautiful or poetic or things like this. I'm talking about some very ugly things, but this is one of the ways that art functions, is that it can take these really dark and difficult experiences and transform it through other experiences that are sort of wonderfully crafted and beautiful and powerful in the way that they work. They become much more compelling in that way. The sculpture, the figurative sculpture by the artist, of the chained individuals, only works because that's such an extraordinarily good, modeling of those individuals. Another structure we're going to be looking at we're getting down to the final little bit in our talk here. One of the final memorial structures we're going to be looking at is a Jewish museum in Berlin that was designed by Daniel Libeskind. And we're actually going to be looking at two structures that he has designed, and this is the first one. Sort of imagine this as a design problem, an architectural problem. The Jewish Museum in Berlin, at one point, probably 25, 30 years ago, said, we'd really like to have this addition on our building, and so we need to, sort of get that going. And again, they sort of opened a proposal, they took applications. But just imagine the architectural problems, not just physical problems, but the architectural problems that are present in Berlin, the seat of government during the Holocaust, and like how do you sort of capture and represent within that architecture, all of the events that transpired at the location relative to the Jewish people. It's just a massive question that sort of hung over this. And so they opened up this call for entries. Many people, I only really saw the Libeskind design, but my understanding was that many people had, submitted proposals. And Libeskind submitted the one that was eventually selected, which is the one that we're looking at here. So in the photograph, what you're seeing is the previous structure, which is the orange structure, kind of the U-shaped one on the right, and Liebeskind's design is the gray one that's kind of snaking angularly off to the left. And so you have the old structure and the new structure, and one of the things that happens here is that he has created a building which itself has many metaphors built right into the architecture. And the first of which is that to get to the new museum, you actually have to go through the old museum. So you have to, there's not like a front door on the new museum. What you have to do is go into the old one and then literally go down the steps and across and then up into this newer museum, which, wow, that's a really powerful metaphor. If you want to understand contemporary Judaism in Germany, you have to understand old Judaism in Germany and travel through that. And that's the kind of metaphors that he weaves throughout this. Another set of ideas that he weaves into this structure right here is when he first started laying this out, he got a big map of Berlin and he started, pitting points, identifying points on the map where Jewish philosophers, thinkers, theologians, writers, mathematicians, like all these points of Jewish identity on the Berlin landscape, and then drawing lines across the structure he was going to build. And some of those lines, not all of them, but some of those lines got built into this architecture. And so some of the lines of this structure on the left actually point to specific locations. So that's one point of reference. And another point of reference is actually a Star of David. There are angles here in his building which reference the Star of David. Libeskind does several noteworthy things in the way that he has constructed the space that speak about the Jewish experience. On the top left is the outside of the building, and the building kind of looks like this all the way around. And so you are seeing kind of this stainless steel exterior, and then you have these penetrations that go through these windows that let light into the space. But they are not sort of like the tidy windows that you find on any other kind of building. They are sort of almost like lashings or scars across the surface of the building. And they also don't relate to the interior of the building in a typical way. Like they're not sort of, 2 feet off the floor and open up to the outside. It's like you can see in the bottom right there is part of the building on the inside that shows how these windows actually function. And so what this does is it creates a great sense of disjuncture. It creates a sense of confusion, even sort of hostility at times about between this interior and the exterior. You sort of feel like there's a sense of disorientation as you're going through. So why does he do this? And Libeskind, to his credit, did not want to create a museum where there was just, space on the inside for Holocaust, imagery. What he wanted to do was to have the building itself represent the experience of Jews in Germany, especially, post, like pre and post World War II. So he wanted the building itself to kind of represent struggle, disorientation, sacrifice, loss, and all of that. Some of the spaces that are present, you can see, a stairway on the left and a hallway on the right are like completely imposing. As you go into the space, they're overwhelming. They're not friendly spaces. They're sort of massive and towering over you. And again, they seem to have parts about them, the surface of the planes of the building are interrupted. It's not a friendly space. It's actually kind of a very uncomfortable space. It's disorienting and at times hostile. And this was his intent. He wanted the viewer to sort of experience that. He wanted the viewer to sort of, walk in the shoes of people that had been, through that kind of experience themselves. Another curious detail that Libeskind wove into the architecture of the space is that you can walk through this entire structure, and there are actually like 6 or 7 quite large voids, and those are spaces within the building that are completely closed off to everything. Like nobody has access to them. You can't see them. You can't look into them. And it was kind of his belief, I think, that if you got to know the space well enough over time, you would understand that there were parts of the building that were inaccessible, that there were parts of the building that were just completely lost to you. And that, again, is a metaphor. For him, it's like, part of contemporary Judaism is, especially in Germany, it's like we don't know what was lost in the Holocaust. The loss is beyond our ability to even comprehend its scope. And so those spaces, even though they're not direct and clear, it's not like there's a balcony you can look into them. They're just, you have to kind of know the space for a long time before you see these voids that are simply inaccessible. There are some other direct kind of images in the space. You can see these 2 individuals down here. This is a hallway where these faces that are about the size of, maybe 12, 14 inches across, cut out of steel. Kind of these very rudimentary faces with 2 eyes and a mouth. And they're just on the floor. And to walk from one end of the space to the other, you have to walk across these faces, and they kind of rattle around, and they're a little slippery. Again, as he wanting you to sort of experience that sense of disorientation and a sense of confusion, a space that's not comfortable. The final category that we are looking at today, or the final reason, way that artists engage this idea of sort of death and despair, like why they do this, is to actually think about it being a vehicle for change. The act of making and experiencing art about death and despair can transform our negative experiences into positive ones and allow us to look forward in an authentic way. It can also emerge from a desire to leave a legacy too. But the first part of this, again, this is not about, art can turn bad things into good things. I think that's a really simplistic way of looking at it. But what it can do is give us a vision of something different within a difficult reality. We're going to move a little bit more quickly through the last half a dozen or so slides and take a look at this structure right here, this event. And these are the World Trade Towers. You probably have heard of this. My guess is that nobody who's listening to this in the class was alive. For this, I was. And the 2 towers that were hit by the 9/11 terrorists, and the towers collapsed. And great loss of life. It was a national tragedy. There was a lot of things going on there. But After the initial sort of year or two after the dust kind of settled both figuratively and literally, a question started to emerge and like, well, what do we put back up in this space? And this actually becomes a really interesting set of questions about like, what do we value? How do we approach this again? Like, what does this mean to build a building one way or another way? And so that's what we're going to talk about next, is actually this process. And I have about half a dozen examples of different potential drawings that people had, or different proposals they had for this site. So these were the initial buildings put by Yamasaki and Associates in the 1977. These were built and put up. And of course, after they were collapsed, one of the initial proposals that people had is like, well, let's just build them exactly how they were before. It's like that would be the most appropriate response. We're not going to let anybody sort of win. We're not going to allow them to sort of change our lives. And that was kicked around for a while, but it was deemed kind of unrealistic. It's like, would people want to live in those structures again? Even if you sort of built them again like that, would people want to dwell in them? After having seen that, that's a pretty powerful image. And also, we need to remember that the site now is really complicated because, first of all, it's not a public site; it's a privately owned site. Second of all, it's a site of warfare. It's like a war memorial. Kind of. It's also just like a personal memorial. And also it's like some of the most expensive real estate on the planet. You had all of these competing, intersecting, conflicting kinds of stories that were being told about this space that needed to be sorted out before this could be dealt with. So the first set of ideas that emerged, the owners of the space said they put out a call for entries. I've talked about that before. They got a bunch of entries, and they all generally look like something like this. Sort of looking back, they were not nearly as tall. They were, they were lower. They were, like a lot of brick and kind of, hiding into the the surrounding buildings. They didn't really stand out so much. They put these out in front of the public, and I believe that this was actually the one that they chose. They said, this is the one. This is what we're going to do to replace this. And the pushback from the community was, swift and hard, which was like, we hate these. These are, we don't want these. We don't like where they're going. They don't seem to capture anything about this spirit that we need to capture. So they went back to the drawing board, and this next time what they did was they put out a nationwide call for entries. And so they said, anybody that would like to propose any kind of proposal, you can do it, because they realized that this was not just a private matter anymore. This was a larger American question. And so they got like 5,000 or 6,000 entries. I had friends that actually proposed entries for this who had no business designing like a 3-story house, let alone a 100-story building, but they just wanted to participate. It was important for them to kind of participate in this vision of what should the next thing look like. So this was one of the proposals, kind of quickly nicknamed the picket fence, by Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, Charles Guamathi, and Stephen Hall. This is a minimalist grid. So there's the 3 kind of grids, the 3 buildings that you're looking at, and then 2 off to the left. And this was, again, one of the finalists, because they put this call out. They got like 5,000 proposals. They weeded that down to like a smaller number, and then they weeded that number down to like 5 or 6. And what I'm showing you are actually like the 5 or 6 which would have been like architects that were serious enough that they could actually get the job done, that had a vision that the private owners were on board with, that seemed to solve some of these problems. So you have this one right here, and this was the first one. This was by United Architects. I believe they might have been British, don't quote me on that, but one of the things you're starting to notice here with these is that no longer do we have like the single structures, but people are very, very keenly aware of the fragility of a tall, slender structure, and so they're trying to design structures that not only are more stable, that could withstand some terrible things happening to them, but also just like feel like they are more stable. Foster and Partners. Foster and Partners are a major British architectural firm. Norman Foster is. And this was their design. And one of the things, and I think this was actually one of the final three. And so this, what you're looking at here, again, the height of the standard towers, two different towers about 2/3 of the way up. You see this little space that's kind of adjoining the two sides of the towers. So the towers are actually attached at the top, and then this platform up at the top, which is an open plaza, and that would be a substantially large space. You could just an open air plaza that you could walk around. So this was the Foster and Partners. This was the second one of the three, was by Think. That was a group of architects that worked together, and what they said was, well, we don't want to rebuild the building how it was because that is now sacred space. And so what we need to do is we need to build a space around the space that the Twin Towers used to occupy. So these shells right here were actually the second of the three finalist designs. And so these would have been large sort of skeletal structures. Again, the white thing between the two sides, about three-quarters of the way up, is a museum. So it's a museum in the air that would sort of document probably the events of that day. But this would have actually very little sort of replace that office space. It would not be a functional structure. It's basically just kind of a large memorial structure in itself. And this was the final design by Daniel Liebskin. And the design that now exists was also by Liebskin. It's been transformed a bit from this one, but this was Liebskin's design that was chosen. It's pretty interesting to think about these last three that I showed you, the Norman Foster, the Think Group, which is just like the skeletal structure that I just showed you, and then this one right here, in terms of memorial, because putting these buildings up, it's like many people lost their lives there, and so these buildings were not simply just replacing office space. This was a place that needed to be a memorial. At the same time, I have a real problem with the second one, which was, do we really want to build 210-story buildings, that don't have any space as a permanent monument to this tragic thing that happened in 2001? I think that the Think Groups, was a very backward-looking object, a backward-looking bit of architecture. And I would not want to live with that for the next 50, 100, 150 years, And so I think the first one by the Foster Group, that was, I think, pretty viable. But a couple of the things that happened with this one right here, Liebskin's design was really important. And I think some of the metaphors that he wove in, remember, as the designer of the Jewish Museum, he was very interested in finding metaphors within the building itself. And one of the metaphors that Liebskin found that he built it on was this early design of this structure. You can go back and you take a look at it, but the structure reaches the top part of, the top third of that building is all glass, and glass is green. And so for Liebskin, what he was looking at with this building was actually the Statue of Liberty, and like the way that the way that torch of freedom, is held high, and the way that it reaches, the way that it sits against the sky. And so that was the thing that he wanted to capture. And he talks about being a child and, coming to America, escaping bad people in Europe and, getting here, and as a child seeing the Statue of Liberty and understanding what it meant. For him, this was not an abstraction. And so this is one of those situations, I think, where Liebskin sort of understood that, yes, it is a memorial, but it is a memorial that needs to look forward. It's a memorial that needs to pitch ahead, looking ahead in a way that suggests growth and possibility. We remember tragedy, but we move ahead in sort of wonderful ways, or we move ahead in assertive ways. So other things, and this, what you're looking at right here is actually the final slide that we have today, and this is the final version, which now exists in New York City. And you can see a couple other qualities about the structure that Liebskin designed. Down on the bottom, you see those two little squares that are sort of illuminated in light, and those are actually the footprints of the previous buildings. Some of you probably have been there, and they are filled with water. They're a continual memorial. One of the things that Liebskin designed within this entire complex, because it actually was not just a tall building, there are several shorter buildings that were destroyed as well. But one of the things that he did within this was to orient all of the buildings so that every September 11th, at the time when the towers were hit, the the footprints, the memorials, don't have any shadow from any buildings in them. You know, it's like it's an intentional way there. Like he just sort of arranged it and calculated the light and the, you know, the sun and whatnot, so that there are no shadow within those two structures. Another thing that he designed is that the Freedom Tower is 1,776 feet tall. 1776 is a, you know, a pretty major American, you know, year for us. And so he sort of built that in there too. And so you have these symbols that become really important and really forward-looking. So if they were asking Ken, you know, what I would say is absolutely, I think you picked the right one. I didn't, you know, the Norman Foster one I think was okay, but to me this was the one that seems to acknowledge, you know, both the, you know, the past. You know, we don't want to ignore the past. We don't want to ignore a tragic site, but we don't want to be bound by it either. It doesn't define us moving forward. And I think that the Norman Foster one, the first of the three that I showed you, you know, is perhaps a little bit too isolated. It doesn't maybe remember the past enough. I think the one that's only the skeletal structures remember the past way too much. But this one finds a nice balance between those two poles. So. All right, well, that's our lecture. Ernie and I think he wants to get up now and go in the house and talk about this. He seems pretty excited by a lot of the things that I had to say. So I have that ahead of me. So go ahead. Don't forget to take the quiz, of course. And again, like I've said with the other quizzes, the quiz is not going to be about who did what. You know, this is not a slide quiz that you get in art history. This is about some of the bigger ideas that we talked about with the individual artwork. So you can spend your time thinking about that. Thanks. We'll see you.